Hello Scotland fans, and welcome back to our series exploring the best historic sites around this great little nation. The first three videos we looked at some great lowland castles, so we've got family history in there, we covered all the kind of Jacobite angles that came up, bit of Outlander crept in as well. For these three videos though, we're now going to move up north to the Highlands and Islands. We've got three crackers lined up, starting with...
Duart Castle, and they say West Coast is the best coast. I think
they do indeed, and they'd be absolutely right.
I mean, slightly biased on that maybe, Neil? Don't know.
Just a
You've got a Glasgow man and an Edinburgh lad here working together, which is a rare thing, guys.
What can you do?
Yeah, but we are heading out to Duart Castle this time, and Duart is to be found on the Isle of Mull, which is probably, would you say, one of the more accessible of the Hebridean Islands?
Yes, it's one of the ones that I like to think of. If you get a sudden good burst of weather in Scotland, Mull's one that you can go to at fairly short notice.
Yeah.
We don't need to think too much about it. It's pretty accessible, easy ferry from Oban, and that journey from Oban to Craigmuir on the ferry. Wow.
That is one of those moments I will never forget. Actually, the first time I got on that ferry, heading over to Craigmuir from Oban, seeing Duart Castle on its cliff, perched over the Sound of Mull. I mean, you feel like you're in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. I know it's cliche to say that, but you really, really do. And that whole area, I've come to refer to it as the castle corridor, basically, because you're basically just ping-ponging from side to side of the boat, going from castle on the left, castle on the right.
Yeah.
I mean, even just leaving Oban, you see Denali Castle.
That's true.
You can see the castles of the Isle of Lismore off in the distance. There's a few others on Mull as well. But no question in my mind, Duart is the king of castles in that area.
Yes, and it's a fantastic introduction to Mull. So it's pretty much the first thing that you will really clock onto as you arrive on the island. It's a very popular island, but it's still nowhere near as popular as the likes of Skye. But it's got a bit of everything, and history is at the very heart of it.
Definitely. Now, there are some distances to cover. Mull's one of the larger of the Hebridean Islands. Because I'm slightly masochistic, I like to cycle everywhere. And I've cycled out to Duart a number of times. It's only about 2 miles, actually, from the ferry terminal at Craigmuir, so that's quite doable. But you can easily extend a trip to Mull, even if you're going by bike, to places like Lochbuie, where you get Moy Castle, brilliant standing stones there as well. Pop on up to Tobermory and you'll go past the ruins of Eros Castle as well, part of the castle corridor. Still not made it to Iona though.
Yes, and Iona is a very special place. Anyone who's been to Iona, it's accessible, a very short ferry journey, it's 5 minutes across from Mull. And there's an atmosphere, there's something very, very odd. I mean, it's a religious island for the most part, something very spiritual still manages to hang in the air. And this is Scotland at its oldest. This is largely Argyll here we're talking about. This is the oldest part of Scotland.
The cradle of the Scots.
Precisely, yeah. So let's look at the story of Duart then. Go further back and right back to the beginning.
I mean, it's seen just about everything.
It has.
Most times when you see a castle in Scotland, especially if it's up on a rocky promontory of any kind, there's almost always prehistoric settlement there. So all we know is that there was some kind of at least Iron Age fortification at the site of Duart Castle. So many of these places have been, inhabited to certain extents for thousands of years. The continuity of history in this country is just phenomenal, and it would have been a very valuable outpost against the Vikings.
It was, and I knew that word was coming up.
Yeah,
it had to be the Vikings.
Yeah. We've got no hard feelings against them though, do we?
No. I think there's something that's faded with time. Although I think if you're in the Sound of Mull and doing that famous ferry journey, you picture Viking longships coming screaming in to rape and pillage. I think our position may have been slightly different back in those days.
Maybe from the 21st century perspective, we're not quite as appalled by all this.
Yeah, we've romanticised them.
Yes,
they're a friendly bunch.
But that's why getting the ferry over is such a brilliant way to do it, because you feel a bit like you're immersing yourself in that world. And what better way to see one of the seats of the Lordship of the Isles in a place where seaways have dominated than getting there by boat. So it's a brilliant sort of introduction into the atmosphere of that part of the world. And it's a great castle for sort of strategically dominating that area as well, because it's right at the junction of several waterways, so anyone coming into that area, you're going to be able to clock it from the walls.
Yes, great vantage point. And it is in a bit of a cliff edge, Duart, so very dramatic, but great visuals across the spectrum. They can see an attack coming. but we don't know a huge amount about the Viking time. This is going back to the kind of the 9th century and stuff, right? But it's before records began almost.
Things are still quite hazy at that point. So what we do know is that by the mid-1200s, there was some form of castle at the site that Duart now stands on. But the castle we see now is a bit of a mishmash, actually. You'll have heard of Ilendonnan Castle.
Yeah. One of our most, it's probably our most photographed one. Maybe Edinburgh's a contender, but
maybe
it's pretty much up there. Yeah.
Check your nearest shortbread tin for a picture of Ilendonnan on the cover.
It'll be there.
And it deserves that reputation, but what Duart and Ilendonnan have in common is that they were both reconstructed, actually. They were demolished during the Jacobite risings because both the people who inhabited Ilendonnan and those who inhabited Duart supported the Jacobites, and they got blown to smithereens. So both castles are actually early 20th century reconstructions. And in Duart's case, it's become very much the spiritual home of the Clan MacLean. There was a huge clan gathering in 1912 when works were really underway, with pipers leading a procession of kilted lads. It was quintessential Scotland, right?
Yes, every weekend.
Yes, and what you'll find actually if you go to Duart, and we were chatting about this before even shooting the video, is how welcoming they are there. Obviously, if you're a MacLean, you'll get a little bit extra, but even if you're average Joe showing up, it is a family home. The Earls actually do still live there.
They've retained that superbly well. And when you go in, of course, it's to this day, it's still lavish, it's still opulent. There's lots of regalia hanging from the ceiling and stuff, isn't it?
Everything you want from the inside of the castle, guys. Weapons hanging on the walls. There's regimental displays. Medals from various wars fought over the centuries by members of the MacLeans of Duart. There's fancy chandeliers, knights in armour, turnpike stairs, nooks and crannies. There's even a room which documents a shipwreck, which is nearby, which is part of the Spanish Armada, and they've got one of the cannons from that ship in the castle, actually. And they do have some cannons out front of the castle too.
Yes, I've seen them. Yeah.
Can you just imagine? I mean, sort of a enemy ship comes into that bay, and you're just behind one of those. I mean, you could see why it was such an indomitable position for them to be in. And as far as we know, I mean, Duart Castle didn't see a ton of action over the centuries, but it's got some cracking stories.
And what I've understood, I mean, we've talked about the Jacobites very briefly, so what was their position, the family position regarding the Jacobites?
Yeah, the MacLeans of Duart very much supported the Jacobites, in particular in the rising which was in 1688 and 1689. You've almost certainly heard of the final Jacobite rising with Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that, but that's the 5th rising. It's the best known, but arguably it wasn't even the most effective. The first one was right in 1688, 1689, and that's the one that MacLeans of Duart got involved in. And it was after renewing support for the Jacobites in the 1715 rising that they ended up losing their lands, and Duart was basically used as a garrison for government troops. And this is something that you find over and over and over again, especially throughout the Highlands, is that the castles of the clans who supported the Jacobites were then occupied by government troops and then usually either deliberately destroyed to an extent or just left to rot, basically.
That's often the way of it. And what about the Wars of the Three Kingdoms then? 'Cause that's another big chapter in Duart's story.
Absolutely, yeah. So the War of the Three Kingdoms is a term you might not have heard before. It's more popularly referred to as the English Civil War, but historians are increasingly pivoting away from that as a title for this period in history, because it didn't involve just England. In fact, a great many people died in Scotland, Wales and Ireland, and even abroad as well. You had support coming from places like France for that war. So it was, arguably an international event. The MacLeans of Duart again sort of got behind that, supporting the royalist faction. Even after Charles I had his head chopped off, they were still right behind him.
Staunch loyalty. Imagine that.
That is staunch to the extent. If you're supporting a man without a head,
yes, exactly. Yes.
That takes a certain amount of commitment, right? Now, speaking of men without heads, there is, of course, a couple ghost stories.
Good. The mythology around a Scottish castle and the historic tales of woe, for the most part. Yeah,
usually if there's a ghost, it's not because happy things happen there, right? So one tale is that there is a headless horseman which rides across the Black Point, which is what Duart means in Gaelic. Actually, it comes from Duard, Black Point. If you've been picking up any Gaelic on the Duolingo app, which has recently made a smash.
I saw that. That's terrific.
Happens try.
I'm delighted,
Yeah, I'm rubbish at languages. We'll see how
yeah,
it goes.
me too.
But but the horsemen allegedly ride sort of across the Black Point, presaging the death of the MacLean chieftain. So it's seen as quite an ominous symbol.
Yes, yeah.
And this is something you get across the Highlands in many areas of the world, actually. These ghosts showing up before something terrible happens, basically.
Yeah.
But there was another fairly tragic story as well.
I think this is bound. This is Scottish family history, of course. So it's going to involve on the west coast. The MacDonalds are going to be there somewhere as the Lords of the Isles. Yeah. The McDougalls will be around, and the Campbells will be present. So I think what you're suggesting is the story of Catherine Campbell. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. There were a few kind of dodgy episodes at Duart Castle, actually, but we'll get to that. Catherine Campbell, for once, Campbell's on the receiving end of the abuse. Imagine that. But
doesn't happen often.
Doesn't often work that way. But this was in the early 16th century. Catherine was the sister of the chieftain of Clan Campbell and the chieftain of the MacLeans of Duart, Lachlan Catanach, married her and got quite frustrated when they didn't produce any children after trying for a while. And the way he decided to vent that frustration was by tying her to a rock and dooming her to die when the tide came in. A bit unconventional.
Watery grave.
Yeah, it's known as Ladies' Rock to this day. You can only see it at low tide because during high tide it is completely submerged. So, fed up with his wife, he lashed her to this rock and checked the next morning and she was gone. So, he assumed that she had drowned and gone to a watery grave.
More than likely.
Well, have you ever gone for a dip in those parts?
Yeah. That'll be what kills you first.
Yeah, absolutely. So he assumed, right, job done, and he reported back to the Campbell chieftain with a very, very heavy heart, of course, and I'm sure faking a few crocodile tears, right? Oh,
wounded widower.
No, my beloved has vanished. I can't explain this. And what he didn't know was that his presumably ex-wife, had already gone back to her family, having survived. She was rescued by a fisherman, and her brother knew full well because she was with him. And so he was probably there, okay, right?
Hello, Dina's husband.
Aye, sure she did, that kind of thing. And so he let a little time go by, and then he invited Lachlan Catanach down to the Campbell seat of Inverary Castle. The Inverary Castle that we now know. It was an earlier iteration of that castle. And he wanted to have a feast, and when Lachlan Catanach showed up for this feast, who was sitting beside the Campbell chieftain?
Awkward!
But Catherine. Safe to say there were some words exchanged, I'm sure. But he was actually allowed to leave with his life, which is pretty remarkable considering...
It doesn't sound right at all.
No, exactly. This can't be the way it ends, right? And it's not. He went to Edinburgh in 1523 and was murdered by another one of her brothers. Fair enough. Yes. Give them a pass on that one. We'll let the Campbells be a bit brutal this time around. They earned it. There was an earlier incident as well in the mid-14th century where the chieftain of Clan MacLean married a woman named Mary, and in order to win her hand, he actually kidnapped her. And at that point, her dad gave permission for the chieftain to marry her. Because, it proves bravado, and you're willing to do what it takes, and you're cunning and all that.
You have to really want this,
Yeah, Family Feud, Highland style, what can I say?
It's what we do.
Yeah.
So that brings us to a close of this video. It did appear briefly, and it's worth mentioning, in the film Entrapment. So fans of James Bond, the original James Bond, Sean Connery and Catherine Zeta-Jones may remember it appearing briefly there. But other than that, I think we've covered what is one of Scotland's best island fortresses, without a doubt. Yeah. And next time we're heading slightly further up the west coast to Castle Cheetham.
And that's actually owned by rivals to the MacLeans of Duart, so there's some scraps going between them, which we'll be getting into. I know, scraps between families in the Highlands, unheard of. So we'll be getting to that in our next video on Castle Cheetham. We'll see you then.
See you later.